Well, good afternoon, good evening, everybody. Welcome to ULT San Diego, here for the Aquarian series. And this evening, the title of the presentation is Kshanti. And this will be given to us by Mr. Wes Ammerman. Before we begin, in the second chapter of William Kwan Judge's Notes on the Bhagavad Gita, Mr. Judge quotes from the Walt Whitman poem, Leaves of Grass. The passage. That we all labor transmitting the same charge and succession. We few equals indifferent of lands, indifferent of times. We enclosers of all continents, all castes, allowers of all theologies, compassionators, perceivers, rapport of men. We walk silent among disputes and assertions, but reject not the disputers, nor anything that is asserted. We hear the bawling and din we are reached at by divisions, jealousies, recriminations on every side. They close peremptorily upon us to surround us, my comrade. Yet we walk upheld, free, the whole earth over, journeying up and down till we make our own ineffaceable mark upon time and the diverse eras, till we saturate time and eras, that the men and women of races ages to come may prove brethren and lovers as are we. So with that, we give you our very own Mr. Wes Ammerman.
Thank you, Monica. Lovely reading. Thank you so much. Kshanti, one of 6 or 10 paramitas. Paramitas being these wonderful human qualities, actually transcendental qualities of our own nature that we are in the process of discovering, unraveling, unfolding. Patient, sweet, but not can ruffle. Sounds so simple, sounds almost easy, but it's neither easy nor passive, as this image might give the impression. It's really a profoundly active requirement, an active quality of our nature. It requires reaching into our innermost center, centering ourselves, and figuring out how to be of best service to others. Patience. It's a wonderful thing. But it's not easy. Let's see how we move to my next slide here. It's not letting me for some reason. One too far. When I was about 6 years old, my grandmother would tell me when I was in a big hurry to do something, as I always was, patience, sweet. My gosh, she said it so often, I thought she meant sweet was like dear or honey or anything other term of endearment. I didn't find out till years later that it was only a partial quote, that it was patience, sweet, that not can ruffle. I had no idea. So that's kind of was the beginning point of my, let's say, education about this virtue. And I don't think I've learned much since then, but I think we all have this sense about patience. As a wag once wrote, Lord, give me patience, and I want it now. So what we know about patience is usually based on our own impatience. So it almost seems as if impatience is our natural state and patience something we aspire to gain. It would seem to be, at least theosophically, kind of backwards. Our natural state would seem ought to be patience, calm, serenity, the ability to deal with any kind of adversity, outer or inner, with equanimity. But we are in that place where impatience is pretty much the norm. So we want to dive a little bit into this virtue, this paramita, and see what we can learn from it, see how it fits in with the other virtues, the other paramitas, and see what practical applications they might have to our own lives and to the world. Patience is pretty much a universal virtue. The Latin, patientia, means to endure, undergo, to experience, being willing to bear adversities, a calm endurance of misfortune or suffering. Well, we have a similar idea, sablanut, in Hebrew, to bear or to suffer. It's in the Proverbs and elsewhere in the Old Testament. In Islam, we have the Arabic word sabr, which means enduring or bearing, resisting pain and difficulty. It's found in the Quran and the writings of other of their holy writers. Our term, Kshanti, literally in Sanskrit means able to withstand. There's our term. I guess it goes back further than Buddhism, but I'm not enough of an historian on words to know. We have the same thing in the same idea in the Bhagavad Gita, where Krishna in the second chapter says, the senses moving toward their appropriate objects are producers of heat and cold, pleasure and pain, which come and go and are brief and changeable. These do thou endure, O son of Bharata. There, Krishna is speaking to the noble prince, the individual warrior in each of us that is able to withstand, to endure, to bear or suffer as necessary. But underlying so many of these terms is a kind of a religious overlay, a sense that the patience is something due to an outside God, a personal deity, to endure the sufferings that God gives us, as if it's something that comes from outside rather than from within. And this is really tough to overcome, this sense that what happens to us, whether we understand the idea of karma or not, it is somehow somebody else's fault. So we need to look at Kshanti, patience, idea in three aspects. There's the irritation that comes from without, those that bother us or somehow cause us harm or irritate us. Imagine sitting in traffic, waiting and somebody cuts you off. It's an irritation. But where is the irritation? Our irritation is within, is it not? It's not them, it's ourselves. So that brings us to our own irritations, our own pain and suffering, our own difficulties. And a third aspect of Shanti or patience is more subtle. It's not just others or ourselves as a dichotomy. It's a deeper understanding of what the truth of the world is. We could call it the practice of Dharma, the practice of trying to follow that path laid out for us in the voice of the silence, to try to take the position of our own highest, best nature, as pointed out, say, in the Bhagavad Gita, and in fact, in all theosophical writings. So let's look at those aspects. I mean, other people. Yeah, it's almost a trite truism that when you point your finger at somebody else, you've got at least three fingers pointing back at yourself. But this is the most common sort of understanding of impatience, of fault finding, of irritation. We're bothered by things that are outside of ourselves. And then we try to figure out, well, how best to react. And the interesting thing about all of the paramitas is that they are qualities that have to do with our own nature. They're not things imposed from without. They are sort of seed virtues, we could say, that we have already the capacity to grow and learn from and to understand, to make real sense of their meaning, to make sense of the irritation that other people cause us. It's not easy, but it's the first place, it's where we start. We have to start someplace, and we have to start where we are. And where we are is often irritated by what other people do. Oops, too far there. But when we deal with our own irritations, one of the first things we encounter is that it often has to do with how we perceive our engagement with others in terms of time. If we're, for example, engaged in a book we enjoy, a good company, a pleasant situation, a lovely day, then the time goes by really quickly, does it not? If we're sitting in traffic and there are miles and miles to go before we rest, then that time goes by really slowly. As H.P. Blavatsky writes in her Secret Doctrine, time is only an illusion produced by the succession of our states of consciousness as we travel through eternal duration. So, time is our perception, duration always is. So, perhaps one of the keys, philosophically, we might say, is to understand time is to see the distinction between time and duration. The time is our perception that we are being irritated by somebody else as we're waiting in traffic. Duration is the larger cycle, the larger meaning. We could say it's what we could learn from the time that we spend. So duration comes from our own deepest nature. Again, it's not imposed from without. We think of time as something that is steady, but it's not. It's our perceptions of it. And underlying that idea of time is eternal duration, the ever-present now. And so wherever we are is now, and that's the point we can learn from. That's what's really hard about my 5-year-old self and my 70-odd-year-old self. We perceive things from our own succession of states of consciousness, our own perceptions, and not a larger, more universal viewpoint. In a sense, that's what education is kind of understanding, our own nature. What is it that we are supposed to be doing? And understanding time and its relationship to our own internal irritations, those temporary fits of upsetness, we could say, with others, the outrageous slings and arrows of fortune that Shakespeare wrote about in Hamlet. Those are the things that constitute the seeds of our growth, our real growth, not our outer and superficial growth, but real growth. And those things undoubtedly take time. In fact, these are lessons that take lifetimes, I'm sure. Now, the idea of the other kind of suffering, of the path outside ourselves, or the path within ourselves, revolves around this idea of suffering, that the life is difficult. It's one of the truths that Buddha points out and pointed out in his life that we really have to kind of come to terms with. But most of the time, we see it only in terms of what other people do or how we personally feel. But it really is a much deeper reality. There's something basic about the world, about consciousness engaging in a form that makes it difficult by its inherent and necessary nature. It's what life is going to be until we learn the lessons from it. And that in itself is such a profound and difficult truth. We could say, well, how do we do that? And the voice of the silence gives us many clues. One of the things that we may come to realize eventually is that all of the dealing with the suffering and the difficulties of life require two things. They require us to act, and they require us to not act. We need to act wisely, but then how do we act? As the voice says, both action and inaction may find room in thee. Thy body agitated, thy mind tranquil, thy soul as limpid as a mountain lake. Oh, yeah, sure. Soul limpid as a mountain lake. Well, that's the whole task, is it not? Kshanti, as patience sweet that naught can ruffle, isn't just about being quiet. It's sometimes about being really active on the outside and really calm on the inside. And that, in a sense, is the whole crux of our spiritual evolution. It's what our lives are meant to help, are meant to solve. It's one of the purposes we engage. It's why we endure dukkha, the suffering, because it's absolutely necessary for us to go through the agitation to understand how valuable the limpid lake of our own minds can be. And as the voice of the silence points out, this is one of those things that takes lifetimes. And that's okay. It's, I think, useful to see these virtues as as lifetimes in training. And the voice points out that path of developing the tranquil mind is not only possible, but it's universally possible. Human beings are, by our nature, both the agitated, the action, the active, and the tranquil, the inaction. And I think that goes to another virtue, but it's a good place for us to start in thinking about Kshanti as patience. Here. There's a word that helps us understand this activity of and the difficulties of life. Why there is this dukkha? Why there is suffering? Because it's one of those universal questions, whether one has a religious or materialistic viewpoint, whether one is philosophical or not, regardless of one's background, people ask the question, why? In the East, the voice of the silence, so many other texts, it's a simple idea. The idea that the wheel of life turns, and what we experience in one life as pleasure or pain, maybe it's opposites in another. And as the voice says, that the wheel of the good law moves swiftly on. It grinds by night and day. The worthless husks it drives from out the golden grain, the refuge from the flower. The hand of karma guides the wheel. The revolutions mark the beating of the karmic heart. This samsara, what literally means wandering, also implies the cycle of change that the world undergoes, is the nature of the world. That the cycles move on. It's part of understanding all the paramitas, all the virtues. But I think it's particularly useful in understanding this idea of patience, because if we have real patience, we'll wait for the wheel to turn. We'll wait for the good law. We'll trust in our own higher spiritual nature, which is identical with the spiritual nature of all of life. See, the wheel is all inclusive. It has all the principles. It has that essential nature of all of life. There is no other than the wheel. That's what's incarnate. But in the center of the wheel is always that point of calm. And finding that point of calm is perhaps the beginning point for finding that virtue of Shanti. That, we call it patience. It's a wonderful way to think of calmness as being universal as well as particular. Let's see here. There's a lot, and we're relying on Blavatsky's Voice of the Silence for this idea of Shanti, because it gives a really broad and philosophical approach to it. Remember, in theosophy, we begin with moral and spiritual training. And we should never lose sight of that. It's something that's part of our necessary journey. It's just that if we are wanting to be of service, which is the first and virtue, the first paramita of dana, of charity, then we have to be willing to take all the steps necessary to be of real service. So the Voice has a lot to say in its middle pages about the virtue of Shanti. Be of sure foot, O candidate, it says. In Shanti's essence bathe thy soul, for now thou dost approach the portal of that name, the gate of fortitude and patience. So fortitude, the ability to withstand the slings and arrows of outrageous fortune. She continues further, beware of trembling. Neath the breath of fear, the key of Shanti rusty grows. The rusty key refuseth to unlock. So here we have the key of our own nature needing to activate that lock of our own nature. And we've gotten rusty over lifetimes. That's kind of the sad truth of it. The key of our own nature doesn't unlock. We haven't trained it. We haven't polished it. We haven't oiled it well enough for it to unlock. We've the habit of impatience. We have the habit of lack of awareness of our own spiritual nature. And so we find it difficult to be patient. We find it, all of the virtues, all of the paramitas have their difficulties. And she says, but once that thou hast passed the gate of Shanti, step the third is taken. The body is thy slave. Now for the fourth prepare, the portal of temptations, which do ensnare the inner man. Now here's a clue, right in the middle of the Voice of the Silence, that there are those portals, those keys that we need to turn, which kind of bother us on the outside. And certainly impatience is one of those things. We're impatient with ourselves. We're impatient with other people. We're impatient with the path we're trying to tread, even if that path is just doing whatever is good for us personally. Whatever it is, we have trouble with it, and we've inherited our own difficulties. But these three, the first three of dana and of shila and of shanti, that is of charity, of discipline and balance, of harmony, and of patience. These are, in a sense, part of our outer difficulties. A wonderful work by B.P. Wadia, wonderful student, wrote a work years ago, Studies in the Voice of the Silence. And he writes in there, I think this is really a crucial thing to understand about Kshanti. He says, Dana, Sheila, and Kshanti form a triad, for love creates harmony, and without patience, harmony cannot be created. The balanced offspring, whether a word or an act, a poem or a picture, has for its father love and for its mother patience. When the child is created, its nature of perfection makes it a masterpiece, and there is bliss ever after. I think this is a genius insight that whatever we do with our active outer nature, we have to have that love to have harmony. And we have to have the patience. And we have to be able to integrate those two in some kind of a balance. And when we do that, there is the beginnings of a masterpiece. And that masterpiece is not ourselves personally. It becomes the beginnings of a tool that we can use to serve others. We really need to keep in mind that the paramitas, this what we would call yoga in the Bhagavad Gita, or the Patanjali's sutras, they really are about developing those tools that allow us to serve others. Usually, yoga is seen as a practice in the West, as a way to balance oneself personally. Yoga in the East is, at least from this aspect, from Blavatsky's view of the paramitas and the voice of the silence, all about balancing our outer nature so that it can help serve others. So our personal progress doesn't matter. What matters is the service to others. And from a Western perspective, that's really hard to think about. We think we've got it figured out, but we really haven't, not yet. And that's why works like The Voice of the Silence and the Bhagavad Gita and so forth are such a necessary training tool for us as inheritors in the Western tradition, might say, because we need to integrate this Eastern view with a Western practice. Now, I want to give a shout out to Joe Miller. I don't know if Joe is here today or not, but about a month ago, he gave a wonderful presentation on the Sheila virtue. And one of the things that really stuck in my mind about that presentation is that they are not sequential, these virtues, that charity and balance and harmony and patience and indifference to pain and pleasure, and spiritual energy and meditation are not sequential things that once you get one thing done, then you get to the next one. Our previous slide kind of indicated maybe that was the case, but Joe inspired me to think about how these 6 virtues, 7 virtues, 10 virtues, you can enumerate them different ways, how they relate to each other. And so I used a simple interlaced triangle here. They're often done with different colors, and frankly, I didn't have the skill to figure out how to make these one light, one dark, or color one gold and one blue, or something like that. So you get it the way I could draw it. And what we see here is that there are the 2 triangles, one pointing down has the virtues of what Mr. Wadi indicated, of our lower nature, in a sense, of Dana and Sheila and Kshanti, and 3, in a sense, our more kind of our higher nature, of that viraga, indifference to pleasure and pain, spiritual energy, meditation, dhyana, all of which are center have as the center the idea of wisdom, prajna, which Blavatsky gives in the voice of the silences as in different ways, but we think of it as universal wisdom, universal knowledge, perfect application, all those kinds of things that have to do with universal principles. That's the bliss forever after, in a sense, that Mr. Wadia referred to. But all of these qualities are necessary. None of them stands by themselves. So if we look at, say, the idea of dana or charity, it's really a truly universal idea. In the West, we in religions we have the idea of the love of God or divine love or something like that. And Blavatsky, in a footnote in The Voice, says that it's not the same thing. She says that dana or compassion is an abstract, impersonal principle. So it's required to help us balance all the other principles. See my next slide here. I would see it as a necessary underpinning of all the other virtues, because that underlying unknown, that underlying prajna, is that absolute harmony that she talks about is dependent upon ways to be expressed. So it requires that quiet lake of contemplation, so that charity and compassion have a home, have a place to resonate from. So if we're not, looking just after our own personal goals, then that dana or compassion has a chance to grow into something truly universal. I'm going to go back just to be able to watch these things a little bit, because the Sheila virtue, which Joe did such a wonderful job last month on, it requires our patience, so that we can fall in tune with the harmony of the universe. And that harmony, it needs a unified field of action. And dana provides that. The patience of Kshanti provides that. It interacts with all of the virtues, all the paramitas. And we can probably find those connections. We start thinking about each of them in relation to the others. If we're going to be, for example, and we'll hear about this next month, indifferent to pleasure as to pain, as the virtue of viraga indicates, then, we have to understand and be patient with our own nature and all of those difficulties that we encounter. They are, viraga would seem to be an extension of that patience. Once we have that quality of calm in some way, then we can kind of see past the difficulties. Perhaps then we can become a little more indifferent to our own personal difficulties and pleasures and pains, which are inevitable. Virya, the energy that allows us, that Blavatsky calls it dauntless energy, that waves its way toward truth eternal. That energy has to push back against something, does it not? Take an analogy. A rocket ship take off from the Earth, it has to push back against gravity. And what could we call that gravity? Could we call that patience? Could we call that what is that against in our own nature, that energy is able to push back against. Maybe it's simply how we move forward, get in our car. The motor has to push back against something. And again, its forward energy requires a basis. And in a sense, all of the paramitas, interlaced as they are that basis for that energy. If we're going to do any kind of meditation, this is kind of one of those subjects that getting more attention in the theosophical purview than perhaps it did years ago. But it would seem clear that that real meditation is more than just being calm or just calming the mind. It's not, as we might think, a passive activity. There's a lot that passes for yoga in the world that kind of begins with, well, let's keep the mind quiet. Yes, quiet the mind, but focus it on what? In the Yoga Sutras of Patanjali, fairly early in the work, in the first book, he suggests finding an idea, person, a concept, a value, something to focus the mind upon. And for most of us, that's probably the most useful sort of meditation. Last month, we heard that, that meditation really involves a daily action. It's both a review of the previous day and a preview of the next one. That's, in a sense, what study is in theosophy, is it not? One way to define the search for truth is a search for first principles. And I think we do that by looking both without and within our own nature. Now, we go and look without, and we read a book, we study an idea, we find something to focus the mind on, and then we also have to find those corollaries, those analogies, we want to say the analogs in our own nature, so that the ideas we take in from without have a place to resonate. They require an active engagement by ourselves, not just a passive understanding or a passive or a rote memorizing. Although sometimes those are really useful tools to do, as long as we're not too attached to them, which is why students are encouraged to study and learn a few theosophic principles, maybe to learn the paramitas here, because they're good starting points for our own thought and meditation. But it requires us to actively engage. If it were enough just to be quiet, then stones would be really good meditators. A stone is calm, but that's its nature to be solid and to wait. Its duty is easy, it's dharma. Ours requires, as Blavatsky indicates, our own self-induced and self-devised efforts. And there we have that energy that's required to do anything of use. And we have a sense of the beginning outline of how to balance our own nature, how to balance our own spiritual aspirations with the gaps, with the rusty hinges and rusty keys and locks that are, seem to take up so much of our time and effort in our own natures. So, Blavatsky has wonderful ways of summing up things throughout her Voice of the Silence. One place she writes, "Have patience, candidate, as one who fears no failure, courts no success, Fix thy soul's gaze upon the star whose ray thou art, the flaming star that shines within the lightless depths of ever being, the boundless fields of the unknown. Well, those boundless fields of the unknown are both external and internal, just like patience, which is both necessary from others and from ourselves, and an understanding of the great Dharma, the wheel of life, where we need to be, the lightless depths of ever being, that's where all the light is. That's in our own nature. And it's an important idea in theosophy that deity is both universal and internal. It's that wonderful circle with center everywhere and circumference nowhere. And I think it's interesting to note that that goes back to the 6th century, St. Augustine, I believe. And yet it seems to be almost a forgotten idea in Western thought. But it's essential in Theosophia. It's essential in this idea of the path of service, the path of figuring out how best to further others. It's not about just our own spiritual development. If it were, regular yoga would probably be sufficient, and it would be probably a fairly easy task. But we're really, as aspirants to this kind of wisdom, recapitulating the whole process of evolution. We're taking on and kind of redoing, as part of a larger work, the work on ourselves. So the paramitas, and in fact, all of any kind of useful yoga is part of a larger work. We could say it's the part of the work of the theosophical movement to introduce those seed ideas that allow us to be able to be of real service. And we're as students of theosophy, we're trying to train ourselves to be able to serve others a little more wisely than we have in the past. The paramitas are both steps and they are tools. They're absolutely necessary, but each one of them is not sufficient. Taken as a whole, they become the active powers of an adept. They help us keep our real purpose in sight. I'm sure a better student than I could make correlations between these paramitas and, say, the Shakti powers that Blavatsky enumerates in the Sacred Doctrine. But I think we need to take her summation and the Voice of the Silence kind of as a good conclusion here, where she says that to live to benefit mankind is the first step. To practice the 6 glorious virtues is the second. And so with whatever we achieve, we have to, I think, realize that it is not our personal achievement that matters a bit. After all, the personality that we use in future lives is not our one that we're using today. So everything we think of as being us is really only part of the ocean of life. And she says in the Voice, be humble if thou wouldst attain to wisdom. Be humbler still when wisdom thou hast mastered. Be like the ocean which receives all streams and rivers. The ocean's mighty calm remains unmoved. It feels them not. And yet each stream is important. Each of us has that drop of the ocean in our hearts. And in fact, we are that ocean. We don't know it yet, but we have to remember that's what we really are. That's there we go. I'm gonna stop sharing that screen for now and see if there are questions or comments. I'm sure that there are lots of things I didn't talk about and so little that I actually understand. So, Monica?
What a beautiful presentation. Wes, thank you so much for this. Part of this soul, the spirit is to not know where to begin, but you gave such a pillow, I would say, to sort of like, okay, chill out. Let's talk about the fundamental thing you've got to do. Because one of this student's questions would have been, where do we get started? Do we selfishly look at our shortcomings, with the danger of getting pulled into some space that we can't easily get out of, and so we're still selfish? Or is it that Kshanti gives us the opportunity to calmly perceive in a way that we wouldn't normally, how it is that we can become better servants to mankind? Does that make any sense?
Makes a lot of sense, Monica. And that's really the difficulty is where do we start? And I think it starts by maybe asking some of the questions that you asked. It starts by realizing, well, it's not just about me, but it is about me. It really is. It's about where we are. We have to start where we are. And maybe for me, it was remembering what it was like to be about 6 years old and being told I had to be patient. Now, I don't think I remembered being patient. I'm still not patient. I'm really impatient. I'm really good at being impatient. And I catch myself all the time being impatient. But maybe it's where Socrates started his inquiries. He came to a brilliant realization, and that was he knew he didn't know. We all think we know something. He started with the premises, I don't know anything. So let's start there and see what else I might learn. But it's early in Plato's dialogues that Plato makes the case that in the Meno, real learning is remembering. So Socrates, remember a little bit. Start by remembering a little bit, and you might have a chance of remembering a little bit more. It'll probably take you till your next 10 lifetimes, but that's okay. Start now.
10 of them. Well,
yeah, thinking that we have lifetime, it's both an incentive to begin and a daunting task to think that we're going to have to work on this for lifetimes. So, Judy, can I call on hands, or do you want to do that, Monica? Because I see hands.
No, well, I think you have to, because I can only see you. So if
I didn't realize that.
Up, okay, go for it.
Go ahead, Judy, please.
Ken or somebody can enable me to see, but this is okay the way it is. Whoever you call upon, whatever hand is up.
Okay, I didn't realize you couldn't see everybody because let's see. Well, all right. Go ahead, Judy, please.
Okay, I was getting very impatient to get my question answered, but thank you for your good humor and also your humility. It's very hard sometimes to be humble, especially when you have a PhD. I know this about many of my colleagues and myself. And I thought I knew something until I started to study the secret doctrine. And I realize the more I study the secret doctrine that I don't know anything. And it is very difficult because I just want to stop and say, well, I just want to let me pick up another book, murder mystery or something, or go watch television, or just let me interpret it by someone else's interpretation. No, I realize I have to study the sacred doctrine, as difficult as it is. And we have to have patience. And I think the most important idea, I wonder if you agree with this, is the statement from the Bhagavad Gita, my disciple is unexpecting. Because what do you expect when you encounter the mind of an adept? Of course, you're going to struggle. So what do you think about
I think that's a wonderful line. I had not remembered that was in the Bhagavad Gita, but my disciple is not expecting. I think that's actually, or does Krishna really say, I'm not expecting much from this guy? Maybe we shouldn't expect a lot from ourselves, and we might be pleasantly surprised if we're willing to be humble and try to be of service. Yes, Ed Moskowitz. Go ahead, Ed.
So I found it a very thoughtful talk, and I was wondering if you could share the process by which you came up with the talk.
50 years of trying and not doing very well. That's kind of a trial and error. Friend of ours, a retired medical doctor who used to give wonderful talks, Dr. Joe would say, when you give a talk, and I never quite figured this out, but he says, tell them what you're going to tell them, then you tell them, and then you tell them what you told them. And he was brilliant at it because that's what organized his thinking. Now, I'm not always able, in fact, seldom able to do that. So I didn't give enough clues, but I write things out in outline, and I try to put that outline into something, some kind of a form of, in this case, because of Zoom, I like to share something visual. So then I try to find things that visually support my outline. And I don't have a written out presentation. I just don't do well reading my own script because I tend to go off script. I guess I'm a politician that way. And I just find it better to talk about what I've put in the outline. I don't know if that's helpful or useful at all. It's just what has worked for me. And it sometimes works and sometimes it doesn't work so well. If I could just write them out, then I could just send it to Monica and she could read it for me and I wouldn't have to be here.
Oh, you definitely would have to be here.
Well, or I could just read it and it would sound like I was reading my talk, which, and, everybody does it differently. And I've heard brilliant, absolutely priceless presentations that people have written out and read, and I'm very glad that they can do that and have done it. So it's just a matter of personal preference. I hope that answers your question there, Ed. Thank you. David. Hey, David, go ahead.
Hey, thanks a lot, Wes. That was quite a thoughtful and broad talk. And good to see you also.
Good to see you as well, my friend. We are 3,000 miles apart and about half a millimeter separated.
Right.
Good to see you.
Yeah. One of the definitions of patience, or can be, is to tolerate. So, but my question is, are there things that we should not tolerate in life and not be patient with?
That's a wonderful question. I'm so glad you asked that because yes, there's lots of things we should not be patient with. We should not suffer fools lightly, I think is one way that it's put. If there's something that's wrong with the world, we should be impatient with it. We should not be impatient with ourselves. It's you know, the story goes that Thoreau, Henry David Thoreau, was in jail for protesting. I think probably protesting a poll tax or something, but it had to do with abolition and voting. And Ralph Waldo Emerson visited him and said to Henry, what are you doing in there? And Thoreau's reply was, Waldo, what are you doing out there? Meaning, you should be in here protesting with me. So yeah, there's lots of things that are that we should not be patient with that go on, but isn't it a matter of balance, putting that impatience in some kind of a context? As Joe pointed out last month, these are not sequential virtues. They're integrated, and so we have to have a balance with them and our actions. If we see something that needs correction, we should move and do what we can to help alleviate a suffering, a difficulty, a problem. I knew a woman once that ran for school board because her children were not treated well in the school district, and she made a huge difference in a local school district. She got really impatient with what was going on, and one person made a big difference. I just know that from talking with her and being friends with her years ago. But there's all sorts of times rather, that situations where it's probably better to be impatient than patient. So knowing the balance between the two, I think isn't that not the Sheila virtue? Knowing when to be engaged and when not, how to be harmonious, because it might mean jumping in the middle of something that's just not harmonious at all, but trying to reestablish some sort of balance or some sort of action on a principle or something. So I think that's part of our task of discretion, one could say, is knowing when to act and when not. As that beautiful analogy of the mountain lake from The Voice of the Silence gives us. We were maybe really active on the outside and calm as the surface of that water on the inside. Not easy to do. I'm not saying I can do it. So,
yeah. Thanks, Wes.
Jonathan.
Jonathan?
You're muted, Jonathan.
Thank you. Okay, can you hear me now? Sorry about that.
We can.
Yes. Now we can.
And you're next, Ken.
All right. Thanks for your patience. I was wondering if you could talk a little bit more about tolerance and reliance on the law. Some of the genius of Judge and Crosby is their very simple expression, the elegance of the simplicity, and this idea of calm reliance on the law, right? And if I'm tolerant, well, if I'm really tolerant, there's no problem. But if I'm kind of pseudo-tolerant, like I'm so tolerant, I'm putting up with this or something like that, that's kind of edgy, right? But I was wondering if you could talk about a deeper patience in relation to the calm reliance on law. You've been doing so all along, but I was wondering if you could do it more.
It's a great question, Jonathan. And in the West, we would say, well, it kind of goes along with the idea of personal God. Well, it's God's will or something, and so we're tolerant of things that go on because God's allowing them, I guess. But no, I think you're right. You indicate that there are levels, each of these paramitas, for each of the virtues that we have. They're not simply dictionary definitions, although it's useful to see that there are definitions that we could, we can start with. So when we say tolerance, we don't just mean, putting up with something or tolerating people that hurt others, for example. Thoreau in his writings, he said, if there's something that causes you to be there's just an irritant to you personally, you just let it go, let it go. You're not sort of relying on the law. But if acquiescing means that you are allowing another to be injured or hurt, then he said, put your shoulder against it with all your heart and don't stop until that pain is gone. He says it much more poetically, but that's kind of the idea. He wouldn't tolerate slavery. He wouldn't tolerate injustice to others. It cost him a few nights in jail. Unfortunately, he lived in a time where, they didn't just do more. They didn't do more than throw you in jail. So I think it's a matter of our own discretion to understand what level of tolerance is necessary. Are we just kind of, by tolerating, do we mean just letting people do whatever they want to? Like they were 2-year-olds and you let them just, tolerate them, let them run around and get out in traffic. I'll tolerate any kind of behavior. No, there's certain things you can't tolerate. And you can't tolerate them in 2-year-olds. And maybe there are things that adults we should not tolerate from each other. That doesn't mean we go do violence to them, but it might mean we say something. It might mean we literally stand in the way. It might mean a lot of different things. Again, discretion is what's necessary. Balance and kind of putting our actions and possible actions in that larger context.
Did I follow through with the second part of that?
I hope that. Sure.
Yeah. I just wanted to do it. Also, the other thing about tolerance, if a person is just putting up with another person, what if I don't really understand that person? What if that person actually has a genius that I can't figure out? And if that is a different kind of reliance on the law of their evolution, the law of their genius, the law of their reincarnating what they bring to the table from their reincarnations, whatever wisdom that they have. And so, in other words, the humility part, you did talk about that in terms of kind of, I guess, having patience with oneself long enough to be able to see if one is assessing the situation deeply enough, I guess.
I think that's a great point, and you started with the idea that maybe it's your problem, not theirs. It could be that you can't tolerate them, not because they're doing anything wrong or because maybe they're going through something very difficult in their lives. So it may be that you need to tolerate your own irritation at them rather than just saying, well, I'm going to tolerate their behavior. Maybe there's something you could help with, and maybe there's not. Maybe there's a lesson that you both need to take away from that, but you can't learn their lesson for them. So it might be toleration on your part is what's needed, not so much on theirs. Again, it's a matter of balance and discrimination that, who knows, in the next life, you two we might trade places. You'll be the irritant, or maybe it's tomorrow. And today, they're the irritant. Tomorrow you will be. Who knows? We have a lot to learn, do we not? Lots of hands. Ken, you've been okay. Thanks, John. Ken, and we'll get to Judy and Choba. Go ahead, Ken.
Here. Okay, I got myself unmuted. Oh, thank you, Wes, for this wonderful presentation and this overview with Kshanti as the focal point, but yet going over all the parameters. I love how you said that they don't really go sequentially. One thing though I have been puzzling with is this kind of balancing act of in one of the early slides, or maybe like 20 minutes into it, you have a B.P. Wadia's studies on the voice, where he lists the triad of the first three, the Dana, Sheila, and Shanti as love and harmony and patience that are necessary for each other. And yet in that wonderful glyph you have of the star with the prajna in the middle, it's like, oh, so everything relies on that limpid lake. And I love the other imagery of the lake. But I'm wondering, it's sort of like an intellectual puzzling game, an intellectual balancing act. If we have one triad on one side and the virya in the viraga in the middle, that indifference or that equanimity, then how does prajna then kind of move out from the center, but being the balancing act where we have a different central point? Or is that just some like Tinker Toys game of intellect? Is who's in the middle?
There is a certain amount of, you could say, philosophical gymnastics we engage in here. It's almost necessary to kind of help us grasp certain concepts, and there is maybe a necessary tension, a dynamic between thinking of the virtues as being stepping stones as well as being integrated. So I think both ways of thinking of them are useful. Let's just not get tied down to one thing in a rigid sense of saying, well, that's what this virtue is, and that's how it ought to be, and that's what I'm going to do, and I'm going to do that for like the next 500 lifetimes and see if that's enough. Because if it's good to do now, it ought to be good to do in the future. I think we would misunderstand the dynamic that's going on here, because we're trying to integrate external ideas. We're reading about these paramitas, trying to integrate those with our own nature. And it's because the locks are rusty, the ideas don't all fit. We have to kind of work them loose. And if you ever taken apart an old lock and tried to oil it, it takes a while for the key to start to turn. It's a wonderful analogy, and I think it applies to all of the paramitas, because it applies to every aspect of our nature. Prajna, it's interesting. It is given as a seventh paramita in a sense. It's the seventh portal. It's also not one of the paramitas at all, because it represents universal wisdom that's possible once the paramitas are fully integrated and all the locks are open. And we've really done our job as spiritual beings. We've truly unlocked our own universal nature. And then the paramitas become, you could say, easily applicable in any situation. I mean, how does a Buddha act? How does a Jesus? How does a Christ act? How does a Krishna act? Universally. We only have a glimmer of what that means. But we should have some intuition somehow that it's important. And maybe we can inch toward that at some point, in some way in our lives. I don't know how else to try to approach that.
Well, thank you.
Does that help?
Yeah, that does help. It really is. Okay. I think it's the message. Stay humble, stay flexible, stay humble.
That's what that's what HPB says. I'm going to, follow her. Or no, let's follow the path she shows. How's that? We won't follow her personally. She would be really upset if we said that. But follow the path she shows. Yes, that's what she clearly says in the voice of and elsewhere.
Hey, Wes.
Yes, John.
We're trying to go back to ending the meetings at 5:45. Is that okay, Judy, if we just take up Shobha's question at this point, and then that'll be it?
I'll try to be patient.
Oh, good.
So
just a brief comment. Yeah.
I'll be quick. I was just thinking that instead of saying toleration or anything, how about using the word compassion?
Sure. It's a different virtue, but that's okay.
but they're all connected, right?
Yes, they're all connected. So yes, it may be a good application of patience to think of it as universal compassion. Absolutely. In a sense, there's only one virtue. it's doing the right thing at the right time in the service of others. That's it. That's all it is. And it's aligning, or we could say it's aligning our own nature with that which is universal. And, you know, it's one, that's the virtue. That's, you call it, that's all the paramitas rolled up into one. It's a, you know, kind of it's a unity. We're looking at the elephant from half a dozen different perspectives, or the diamond in different facets. But, you know, we still have a minute. So if you want, Judy, Judy can have the last words.
Yeah, I just want to
Judy.
say, what I get from this dialogue is that we need to be patient, but not passive. I mean, for example, I knew of a case where a woman was being beaten up, and some fellows in the other room said, "Oh, we're nonviolent and we're not going to do anything." Well, in my view, they were cowards.
Mhm.
My husband would have knocked the fellow silly. He was a naval officer, and he wasn't
I think
patient with this kind of thing.
that's a great observation, Judy.
Perfect.
Thank you. And I think it's a wonderful way to end our meeting today. I think that's, yeah, patience is not passivity. It's doing the proper action at the right time, and remaining calm about it. And that's hard to do. So,
Gosh, thank you so much.
well, thank you, and thank everyone here for listening to me for, good gosh, much longer than I thought I would speak. But
Oh, it was
thanks so much.
absolutely a joy. Thank you so much, Wes, for an amazingly in-depth presentation. Grateful for you. So
You're
thank
welcome,
you.
and thank you. Thank you so much.
Okay, well, next week, where do we go? Oh, yeah, Leo, right? Leo? Yeah.
Yes, next week, the 17th, the presentation will be on the astrological sign of Leo. So everybody come back and let's delve into the lion.
We
Right.
can't wait.
Yes, absolutely.
Thank you so much.
Namaste,
thank you,
everybody. Be well
Bye.
and safe.
Okay.
Thanks.
Thank you.
Good night.
Thanks so
Thanks
much.
again.
Bye-bye
Thank
now.
you.
Good night.
Good night.